Snow slammed against the old farmhouse windows. The night was bitter, and the wind howled like it carried secrets. Then headlights cut through the storm. One bike, then another, then 15. Engines roared outside her lonely home. She stood by the door, trembling as strangers and leather surrounded her porch. Before we start the story, tell us where in the world are you watching this from? And if you enjoy our stories, please consider subscribing to our channel. You can also support us by sending super thanks and membership. Eleanor Vance was 78 years old, a widow living alone in a weather-beaten farmhouse on the outskirts of Montana. Her life was quiet, shaped by routines, feeding her chickens, knitting by the fire, and writing letters she never sent. Eleanor wasn't wealthy, but she was rich in memories, some joyful, some haunting. Winters here were harsh, and storms often cut her off from the nearest town for days. Yet, she loved the solitude. It reminded her of her late husband, Arthur, who had always said, "Silence is God's way of letting us listen." That night, however, silence was shattered. Eleanor had just finished her evening tea when she heard the distant rumble. At first, she thought it was thunder, but thunder didn't grow louder and closer, shaking the earth under her wooden floors. She pulled back her curtain and gasped. Headlights, one after another, broke through the snow. 15 motorcycles pulled into her long driveway, their tires crunching on the ice. Fear rippled through her chest. Eleanor had seen motorcycles before, but never this many. Never in the middle of a snowstorm, never on her land. She tightened her robe and peered out again. The men wore leather jackets patched with words she could barely make out, but one phrase glared back: rogue riders. Stories she had heard in town echoed in her mind, tales of violence, of men who lived by their own rules. Her hands shook as the engines died down, replaced by the hollow whistle of the storm. She counted them, 15 riders, their faces rugged, hidden by scarves and snow. For a moment, no one moved. They just stood, their boots crunching, staring up at the fragile glow of her farmhouse windows. Eleanor's heart pounded. Should she lock the door, hide in the cellar, call for help? But there was no phone service here. She was alone. Then 3 loud knocks rattled her wooden door, echoing through the quiet house like a warning bell. Eleanor froze. Her breath came shallow, the old house groaning around her. She thought of Arthur, how he'd always told her never to let fear make decisions. Still, her hand trembled on the doorknob. "Who is it?" Her voice cracked. A deep baritone answered through the storm. "Ma'am, we don't mean trouble. Roads are closed. We're freezing. Could we come in?" His words caught her off guard. The tone wasn't threatening. It was tired, heavy with desperation. She hesitated. Images flashed, strangers at her table, rough hands near her fragile belongings. But then she remembered another winter, decades ago, when she and Arthur had been stranded in their truck. A stranger had opened their home, saving them from the cold. Eleanor unclenched her jaw. She drew a shaky breath, unlatched the door, and opened it. Snow and wind rushed in, and 15 towering figures stepped onto her porch, their presence filling the night like shadows carved from iron. The leader stepped forward, pulling down his scarf. His face was rough, lined from years on the road, but his eyes held something Eleanor hadn't expected: respect. "Name's Ryder," he said, nodding slightly. "We're headed west. Got caught in the storm. Ma'am, we just need shelter for the night." Eleanor studied him. His jacket carried scars, his beard flecked with snow. Behind him, the others shuffled, stamping their boots, their breaths clouds in the freezing air. They looked less like outlaws now, more like men defeated by the storm. Eleanor's instincts screamed caution, yet another voice whispered louder, "They're human too." She sighed. "Come in before you freeze to death," she said, stepping aside. One by one, they entered, stomping snow from their boots. The farmhouse, once filled only with the ticking of her clock, now pulsed with heavy footsteps and dripping leather. Eleanor closed the door, sealing the storm outside and sealing her fate for the night. The men filled her small living room, their leather jackets steaming near the crackling fire. Eleanor busied herself, pulling extra blankets from a cedar chest and setting out chipped mugs for tea. Her hands shook, but she forced them steady. The bikers muttered low to one another, stealing glances at her. Ryder noticed her unease. "We'll behave, ma'am," he said quietly. "Promise." She nodded, unsure whether to believe him. One of the younger bikers, tattoos creeping up his neck, removed his gloves. His fingers were red, almost frostbitten. Eleanor frowned. "You need warmth," she murmured, moving toward him. Without hesitation, she wrapped one of her old wool blankets around his shoulders. The room fell silent. The other bikers watched, surprised at her simple kindness. For a moment, the tension eased. Eleanor didn't smile, but her eyes softened. She had invited the storm inside her home, and strangely, it began to feel less threatening, like maybe, just maybe, there was humanity hidden under all that leather. Eleanor moved carefully, her slippers sliding across the wooden floorboards as she poured hot water into mismatched mugs. The kettle hissed, filling the room with steam. The bikers stood awkwardly, their massive frames shrinking in the coziness of her tiny farmhouse. One man ducked his head so it wouldn't hit the low ceiling beam. Another rubbed his hands together like a boy just back from sledding. Eleanor caught herself staring. These men, painted by the world as monsters, suddenly looked oddly human, cold, tired, almost lost. Ryder cleared his throat. "We'll pay you, ma'am. Food, heat, whatever you've got. We're not freeloaders." Eleanor set the mugs down on the coffee table and shook her head. "You don't owe me a dime. Just don't break anything." The men chuckled quietly, the tension lifting just an inch. When one of them sipped the tea and winced at its bitterness, Eleanor allowed herself the smallest smile. For the first time that night, she began to breathe. The storm howled outside, rattling the shutters. Eleanor sat in her worn armchair, knitting needles in hand, though she barely touched the yarn. The bikers stretched out on the floor, boots unlaced, jackets hung to dry. Some closed their eyes, others whispered stories only they could hear. Ryder sat near the fire, his gaze fixed on the flames. After a long silence, he spoke. "You remind me of my grandmother," he said softly, surprising everyone, even himself. "She used to scold me just like you did out there." Eleanor tilted her head, her eyes narrowing with curiosity. "What happened to her?" Ryder's jaw tightened. "Cancer. A long time ago." His voice cracked, but he hid it quickly, staring harder at the fire. Eleanor's heart softened. She recognized grief. It lived inside her, too. For a moment, the labels of outlaw and old lady vanished. It was just two souls, scarred by loss, sitting in the glow of a fire while snow buried the world outside. Later that night, the farmhouse hummed with an unexpected rhythm. One biker carefully tuned a broken guitar he carried with him, strumming chords that filled the silence. Another dozed, head tilted against the couch. Eleanor brought out a pot of stew she had stretched from potatoes and beans. "It's not much," she said, placing it on the table. The men rose quickly, almost reverently, as if she had presented them a feast. They filled bowls, steam fogging the air, and muttered their thanks. Eleanor ate, too, slowly, watching them with weary eyes. Yet, she noticed something. They laughed, not cruelly, but warmly. Their jokes carried no malice. When one man dropped his spoon, another clapped his shoulder and teased him like a brother. Eleanor thought of the townsfolk who whispered about these men, painting them as demons. But here they were, chewing potatoes, blowing on hot stew, laughing like boys who had found shelter in the middle of nowhere. As midnight approached, the storm only grew wilder. Snow pounded the roof, wind screamed against the walls. The lights flickered once, then held. Eleanor prayed silently they would last. She glanced at the men sprawled across her rugs, some already asleep, others whispering low. One man, barely in his 20 seconds, caught her eye. His name was Finn. He had tattoos up both arms, but his face was young, almost boyish. "Thank you," he said. his voice nearly lost under the storm. Most people see this patch. He touched the emblem on his jacket and slammed doors in our face. You opened yours. Eleanor's throat tightened. She wanted to reply but found only silence. Instead, she reached over and tucked an extra quilt around him. Finn's eyes glistened. He looked away quickly, embarrassed. Eleanor sat back, knitting needles in her lap, her mind turning. Perhaps the world was too quick to fear what it didn't understand. Perhaps she had been too. Sleep came slowly. Eleanor lay in her bed, listening to the muffled snores and shifting boots downstairs. She thought of Arthur again, of how proud he would be that she had chosen compassion over fear, yet doubt still pricked her. What if she had been wrong? What if morning brought regret? She drifted into restless dreams, only to wake at dawn to the sound of engines. At first, her heart dropped. Had they betrayed her trust? She rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain. The snow had stopped, and the 15 bikers were pushing their motorcycles, trying not to wake her as they prepared to leave. Ryder noticed her at the window. He raised a hand in silent thanks. No words, no promises, just gratitude etched across his weathered face. Eleanor's eyes filled with unexpected tears. She had let strangers into her home, and instead of chaos, they had left her with a gift she hadn't felt in years: belonging. The morning sun spilled across the white fields, glistening against untouched snow. Eleanor moved slowly down her porch steps, her boots crunching. The bikers were lined up, brushing snow off their machines, preparing for the long road ahead. Ryder walked toward her, helmet in hand. "We owe you," he said firmly, "more than we can repay." Eleanor waved her hand as if brushing away the thought. "You don't owe me anything, Ryder. Just stay warm and try to remember someone's grandmother once gave you stew." For the first time, Ryder grinned. It wasn't a cruel grin, but one of genuine warmth. "You're tougher than you look, Eleanor Vance," he said. With that, the men mounted their bikes. One by one, the engines roared to life, echoing across the valley. Eleanor stood at her porch, small against the horizon, watching them disappear into the distance. She thought it was over, but what she didn't know was that this night would travel far beyond her farmhouse. Later that day, Eleanor ventured into town for flour and kerosene. The storm had broken, but the roads were heavy with slush. As she entered Miller's general store, the familiar creak of the wooden door announced her. Conversations stopped. People stared, whispers rippled. Eleanor felt the shift immediately. She kept her chin high, choosing her items with deliberate calm. But the store owner, Mr. Miller, leaned across the counter, lowering his voice. "Eleanor," words going around, "folks say rogue riders stayed at your place last night." His tone carried accusation, not concern. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Yes," she said plainly. "They were caught in the storm. They needed shelter." A woman near the flour sacks gasped. "You let them inside your home, Eleanor. They're criminals." Another man muttered, "Reckless. That's what it is." Eleanor's cheeks flushed, but she didn't flinch. "Reckless would have been leaving them to die," she said firmly. The room went silent. For the first time, Eleanor realized her act of kindness had become a public scandal. The gossip spread faster than the snow melted. By evening, Eleanor could hear whispers, even at church, eyes glancing her way with quiet judgment. To some, she was foolish. To others, she was dangerous. An old woman who had invited wolves into her home. That night, her neighbor, Clara Jenkins, stopped by, clutching her shawl tightly. "Eleanor," she said with disapproval dripping from her voice, "I've always admired you, but this, letting them sleep under your roof, what if they'd hurt you?" Eleanor poured her a cup of tea and sat opposite. "They didn't hurt me," she said simply. "They were cold, and they were men. Men with mothers once, men with children, perhaps. I couldn't turn them away." Clara's lips thinned. "People won't see it that way." Eleanor sighed. She looked out the window at the frozen fields, whispering mostly to herself, "Maybe people need to see differently." Clara shook her head, unconvinced. Eleanor knew a storm had only just begun, And this time, it wasn't the weather. By morning, things grew worse. The sheriff himself pulled into her driveway, his cruiser crunching over the ice. Eleanor opened her door, her hands still dusted with flour. Sheriff Donovan removed his hat, his expression heavy. "Mrs. Vance, folks are worried. They say you're harboring criminals." Eleanor stiffened. "I was harboring freezing men in a blizzard," she corrected. Donovan shifted uncomfortably. "Eleanor, I've known you for years. You've got a good heart. But these boys, their name carries weight. Trouble follows them." Eleanor folded her arms. "So does kindness if you let it." The sheriff studied her for a long moment before lowering his gaze. "I just hope you're right," he muttered, stepping back toward his cruiser. Eleanor watched him drive away, the tires spitting slush. Her farmhouse stood small against the snowy plains, but her decision had drawn lines through the entire community. She didn't regret it. Not yet, but fear whispered. What if her act of compassion had painted a target on her door? That night, Eleanor sat alone by the fire, the shadows dancing across her walls. She thought of Ryder's eyes, of Finn's quiet gratitude, of the laughter over bowls of potato stew. Could such men really be the monsters people claimed? Or had the world hardened them because no one dared to show mercy? Her heart wrestled with doubt. Then headlights flared outside. Eleanor's breath caught. Slowly, she walked to the window. Not one bike, not 15. Rows upon rows of headlights stretched down her snowy drive, their beams piercing the darkness like a living constellation. Engines rumbled in unison, powerful, yet controlled. Eleanor opened her door, her nightgown fluttering in the cold. 100 motorcycles stood before her house, lined in perfect rows. Ryder stepped forward again, his voice carried by the winter air. "You gave 15 of us a home in the storm. Now, Eleanor, all of us have come to say thank you." Eleanor stood frozen on her porch, her frail figure illuminated by the glare of 100 headlights. The roar of engines filled the night, yet beneath the thunder was a strange order. No chaos, no recklessness, just presence. Ryder dismounted and walked forward, snow crunching beneath his boots. Behind him, rows of men remained still, their breath steaming in the cold. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Ryder, what is this?" she asked, her voice almost trembling. He looked at her with steady eyes. "Respect," he said, words spread through the chapters. "You opened your door when no one else would. That kind of kindness we don't forget." Eleanor's chest tightened, tears welling. The valley echoed with silence now, the storm gone. But another storm had been replaced, one of disbelief and awe. For decades, Eleanor had lived unseen, just another old widow on the outskirts. But tonight, she realized she was seen more clearly than ever before by the very men everyone else feared. The bikers dismounted in waves, engines shutting down until the night grew eerily quiet. Boots stomped against the snow as men approached her porch, not with menace, but with reverence. One by one, they placed tokens at her steps. Bandanas, patches, gloves. Each item carried their emblem, a mark of who they were. "A reminder that not everyone forgot what you did," said Finn, the youngest, his voice shaking. Eleanor's throat closed. She bent slowly, her old hands brushing the rough fabric. These weren't just offerings, they were vows, symbols of trust. In that moment, the labels faded. They weren't rogue riders or outlaws. They were men who had known hunger, cold, abandonment, and had found in a fragile farmhouse something rare: acceptance. Eleanor looked up at them, her breath visible in the winter air. "All I did was give you warmth," she whispered. Ryder shook his head. "No, Eleanor. You gave us dignity. That's worth more than warmth." As dawn broke, the town stirred with curiosity. Rumors traveled like wildfire. Eleanor Vance's farmhouse was surrounded by 100 rogue riders. Some feared violence, others expected the sheriff to intervene. Yet, when neighbors peeked down her snowy lane, what they saw silenced them. Not chaos, but order. The bikers shoveled her path. They stacked firewood on her porch. They fixed the sagging fence Arthur had once built years ago. Eleanor watched in stunned silence as rough hands did gentle work. "You don't have to," she began, but Ryder interrupted with a firm nod. "We take care of our own. Last night, you became one of us." Word spread quickly. The same people who had whispered against her now whispered something different. Wonder, was it possible these men weren't demons after all? Eleanor didn't speak to defend herself. She let the sight of hardened men repairing her broken world speak louder than any sermon ever could. By afternoon, the line of bikes departed slowly, engines rumbling like a rolling tide. Ryder lingered last, meeting Eleanor's eyes with quiet gratitude. "If anyone ever troubles you, Eleanor, one call and we'll be here." She nodded, touched but humbled. "I pray I'll never need such protection," she said softly. Ryder smiled faintly. "Maybe, but still you have it." He mounted his bike, gave her one final salute, and roared off with the others, their wheels carving black lines through the endless white. When the last engine faded, the silence felt heavier than before. Eleanor stood on her porch, a scarf tied around her silver hair, her eyes glistening. She didn't feel alone anymore. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of belonging, not because she had sought it, but because she had offered it freely. The snow may have buried her farmhouse, but kindness had uncovered her name, and it would never again be forgotten. Weeks later, people in town still spoke of it, the night Eleanor Vance sheltered the rogue riders. Some spoke with awe, some with suspicion, but none with silence. Eleanor returned to her quiet routines, feeding her chickens, tending her hearth. Yet, when she looked out at the fence, mended by rough biker hands, she smiled. She thought of Arthur and whispered, "Silence isn't just God's way of letting us listen. Sometimes it's the world's way of waiting for us to act." Eleanor had acted. She had chosen compassion over fear, and the world had answered with a roar of engines, a chorus of loyalty she never expected. Her farmhouse stood as it always had, weathered, small, fragile, but now it carried a story, one that would outlast even the snow, that kindness, once given, multiplies, and that even in the darkest storms, one act of mercy can light 100 headlights in return. When Eleanor Vance opened her door, she didn't just save 15 men. She saved the truth that compassion can disarm fear. The next morning, when 100 bikes lined her snowy driveway, the world witnessed a miracle of kindness. If the story touched you, like, subscribe, and ring the bell.